Well, good morning again, everyone. I'd say it's good to see you, but you can't see me. This is a really weird experience for me, and I don't like it very much. So even though you can see me, I can't see you, and well, this is what it's going to be for Sunday school for this week and next week, because this is our second to last week of adult Sunday school. And it's kind of a depressing one, unfortunately. I mean, that's kind of how studying the Gospels go. When you get part of the way through, it starts to get to a really not all that happy part. And that's where we are in adult Sunday school right now. We are beginning with Luke chapter 22, starting at verse 66, and then going all the way through Luke 23. So last week, we started with basically the Last Supper. We started with that last section of basically the last things that Jesus did as a free person before he is arrested. And we had a little bit of the arrest. We had the Last Supper. We had this statement from Jesus. We had the statement from Jesus about what we now know as Holy Communion, what we call the words of institution, where he takes bread and wine and says, this is something new. This is a new covenant that's happening. And then he says, but one of you who is gathered at this table is going to betray me. And everyone's very confused about who this is, except I'm sure Judas. Then Peter, of course, insists that he will never, ever get in Jesus' way. He'll always stand by Jesus. He will stand by him, even if it means death. And Jesus says to Peter, before the rooster crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And so this is where we get to. Peter does indeed deny Jesus 3 times. After Jesus is arrested and he's betrayed by Judas, he is arrested by the religious police. Oh, hello, dog. Sorry for that. The dog is roaming, and that's what we get when we do adult Sunday school from my house. So Jesus is arrested by the religious leaders, beaten by religious police, which is just strange. And then we get to, where we pick up with our text for today. So beginning in Luke 22:66. As morning came, the elders of the people, both chief priests and legal experts, came together, and Jesus was brought before their council. They said, if you are the Christ, tell us. He answered, if I tell you, you won't believe, and if I ask you a question, you won't answer. But from now on, the human one will be seated on the right side of the power of God. This is kind of an interesting scenario. They arrest Jesus in the middle of the night, and there was a little conundrum, basically that in order for a trial to be legal, it had to happen during daytime. So they waited basically until everything was legal, even though the things they're doing are obviously not in the spirit of the law. So this trial is kind of questionable legality anyways, from a religious standpoint, and then from the standpoint of the system in place at the time with the Romans really doesn't mean all that much, but they're having it anyways. And then they ask Jesus, are you the Messiah? And Jesus says, it doesn't really matter what I say. You've made up your minds. So then they all said, are you God's son then? And he replied, you say that I am. Then they said, why do we need further testimony? We've heard it from his own lips. That's the extent of Jesus' trial. He's brought before the council, the Sanhedrin, and the responses to his questions are, whatever I say doesn't matter. You've already made up your mind, and you've said that this is the accusation against me. And they decide that's enough. So then the whole assembly got up and led Jesus to Pilate and began to accuse him. Okay, so we need to talk about Pilate a little bit, because Pilate's reaction makes a lot more sense when you figure out the situation that Pilate is in. So first of all, Pilate is, he's the Roman governor of the province of Judea, which is this whole area that is where Israel and such is. Pontius Pilate is his full name. Not his full name, but Roman names are really long. He is in a really bad situation with Rome. I mean, never mind the situation in Judea. Nobody likes Pilate in Judea. But in Rome, he's in a real pickle as well. Because, one, Pilate has a reputation for being incredibly cruel, even for Roman governor standards. So when Pilate first came to Judea, he put down a revolt so severely that the people of Judea wrote back to Caesar, told Caesar about how bad Pilate was acting, and Caesar actually then wrote back to Pilate and said, dude, you need to chill out. So this is how bad a person Pilate is, that Tiberius Caesar told him basically if he has another revolution on his hands, he's out. And that's bad news for Pilate. Now, it also just so happens that Pilate had a patron whose name was, of course, now I'm going to forget it. I can't remember his name off the top of my head, and I don't have anything around me to look it up. So Pilate had a patron, Sejanus. That was his name, Seganus, I think. And Sejanus used to be one of Emperor Tiberius's really good friends, but Sejanus was conspiring behind the scenes, ended up allegedly killing a couple of Tiberius's kids, and kind of took over the empire while Emperor Tiberius went into seclusion for a while, in large part because his kids had just died. And Sejanus was more or less running things, but then Tiberius came back and had Sejanus executed for treason. And so that guy, the one who was just executed for treason, just happened to be Pilate's benefactor. So there's an extra little bit of trouble that Pilate is in, and probably explains why Tiberius was willing to listen to the people of Judea when they told him about just how awful a person Pilate was. So that's the situation that Pilate is in right now. He knows that if he has another revolt, he's going to get fired and sent packing back to probably something resembling exile. So he's going to walk a tightrope here, and we'll see that as we go through how he handles Jesus' trial. So, back to the text. This is the religious leaders, said to Pilate, "We have found this man misleading our people, opposing the payment of taxes to Caesar, and claiming that he is the Christ, a king." Those are some interesting charges. Did Jesus really mislead the people? I mean, I guess you could kind of construe it that way. I mean, he entered into Jerusalem in a very messianic way. He was teaching things that the religious leaders sure didn't like, but I don't know if you could go so far as to say he was misleading the people. And then opposing the payment of taxes, he straight up told people to pay taxes. He says, this coin has Caesar's face on it, so give Caesar what belongs to him and give God what belongs to God. So I don't think you can say that he opposed the payment of taxes, and I don't know that Jesus ever actually claimed to be the Christ. I mean, people claimed it of him. The religious leaders just claimed it of him. Peter had claimed it of him, but I don't know if Jesus ever actually came out and said it. But it is true that the Christ, as people understood it, was a king. The way he entered into Jerusalem was kind of this messianic king's way of entering Jerusalem. So, sure. I mean, I guess if you really stretch it, you can get either the misleading the people or the claiming he is the Christ, a king, but the middle one is just nonsense. And so here we are. Pilate then asked Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus replied, "That's what you say." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no legal basis for action against this man." So Pilate's going, why are you bringing this to my attention? He's not done anything worth our attention. Go away. But they objected strenuously, saying, he agitates the people with his teaching throughout Judea, starting from Galilee all the way here. Oh, now Pilate at this point is going, oh, this is good news. He's from Galilee, you say? Hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was from Herod's district, Pilate sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. This is Pilate's way of getting rid of the problem. Pilate doesn't want to deal with this. He's already decided that Jesus hasn't done anything wrong. So he's like, oh, he's from Galilee. Okay, he's Herod's problem now. So Jesus went to go see Herod. Herod was very glad to see Jesus, for he had heard about Jesus and had wanted to see him for quite some time. He was hoping to see Jesus perform some sign. Now, Herod, remember, was the guy who had John the Baptist arrested, but didn't want to kill John the Baptist because he liked listening to John talk. He also was thinking that Jesus was John the Baptist raised from the dead. And so I'm not surprised at all that Herod would want to meet Jesus because he sees Jesus as John's successor, this person that, while bothersome, he enjoyed listening to. So Herod questioned Jesus at length, but Jesus didn't respond to him. The chief priests and legal experts were there, fiercely accusing Jesus. Herod and his soldiers treated Jesus with contempt. It's interesting how quickly Herod's stance changes. He was so excited to see Jesus, so excited to hear from Jesus. But then when Jesus didn't do what Herod wanted him to do, it was very much Herod wanted Jesus to dance and Jesus didn't dance. And so he did that thing that they do in the old-timey movies when, the bad guy starts shooting the good guy's feet and telling him to dance. Basically that idea. Herod didn't get what he wanted, and so he had Jesus beaten. Herod mocked him by dressing Jesus in elegant clothes and sent him back to Pilate. Pilate and Herod became friends with each other that day. Before this, they had been enemies. It's kind of an interesting little aside that Luke throws in there, that their, shared mistreatment of Jesus led to them becoming friends. It's very odd. But it kind of tells you a little bit about Herod and Pilate. So then Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people. He said to them, "You brought this man before me as one who was misleading the people. I have questioned him in your presence and found nothing in this man's conduct that provides a legal basis for the charges you have brought against him. Neither did Herod, because Herod returned him to us. He's done nothing that deserves death. Therefore, I'll have him whipped, then let him go." This is interesting. It's kind of a very appeasing stance where he's like, well, I don't have any reason to kill this guy, but I want to do something to make you happy so that you don't rebel and get me in trouble. So that's what I'm going to do. I'll whip him and then let him go. Is that good enough for you? Little beating and then he can go away. But it didn't satisfy the people. Now, I do want to stop before we go on to verse 18 here, because in my Bible, the Common English Bible that we've been using for Sunday school this whole time, it leaves out verse 17. But your Bible probably still has 17 in it. And that verse reads, "He had to release one prisoner for them because of the festival." Now, this is a weird tradition that sprung up, that as we've gotten earlier and earlier manuscripts of the Gospel of Luke, that line isn't in there. And that's important for a number of reasons, but the basic version is the way that all of this critical scholarship works is the idea is the earlier they can date a manuscript to, the more accurate it's considered. Because the earlier it is, the closer it is to the original document that we don't have and probably will never have. So this these earlier manuscripts that they've found have increasingly not had that verse in them. And because of that, well, this Bible, which came out in, I want to say 2011. So this Bible is copyright 2013. So it's a very recent translation compared to like the NIV or the New American Standard Bible or many of these other translations that we have floating out there. So this one left out verse 17 because it's not in those earliest versions of the gospel that they've found through archaeology. So that's why I'm skipping that verse. I know that's a whole lot of talking to explain why a verse isn't there, but it's important things to know. So Pilate says, I'll have him whipped and then let him go. But with one voice they shouted, away with this man, release Barabbas to us. Barabbas had been thrown into prison because of a riot that had occurred in the city and for murder. Why in the world would they want that guy out? I have a feeling, and this is totally not based in scripture at all, it's just a feeling that I have that Barabbas was probably the only other person on the first century equivalent of death row at this point. And the people who would probably been stirred up by the religious leaders were saying, kill this Jesus guy instead of this Barabbas guy. Now, there's also a possibility that Barabbas was part of a group that was kind of trying to set himself up as the Messianic king. And so it was kind of one of those, get rid of the guy who obviously failed, Jesus of Nazareth, and instead give us this guy Barabbas back who he's at least done some good trying to pretend to be the Messiah. But we don't know all that much about Barabbas except that he is a revolutionary and a killer. And Pilate is even confused at this point because he doesn't know why they want this guy out. Pilate addressed them again because he wanted to release Jesus, but they kept shouting out, crucify him, crucify him. For the third time, Pilate said to them, why? What wrong has he done? I've found no legal basis for the death penalty in his case. Therefore, I'll have him whipped and then let him go. He's bringing back the same thing again. It's, I don't have any reason to kill this man, but to make you happy, I'll beat him up a little bit and let him go. But they were adamant, shouting their demand that Jesus be crucified. Their voices won out. Pilate issued his decision to grant their request. Remember what I said about Pilate's situation? As the crowd got more and more agitated, it was looking more and more likely that he was going to have a riot on his hands. And that's the last thing that Pilate needed. And so Pilate, in order to save his own neck, condemned Jesus to die. He knew Jesus hadn't done anything wrong, but he was more concerned about protecting himself than about doing the right thing. Now, it just so happens that not long after Jesus died and rose again, there was a rebellion in Jerusalem, and Pilate took things a bit too far, and he did end up going back to Rome in a good bit of disgrace. So, if anything, all this did was put things off a little bit for Pilate. It didn't actually bail him out. So Pilate released the one they asked for, who had been thrown into prison because of a riot and murder, but he handed Jesus over to their will. As they led Jesus away, they grabbed Simon, a man from Cyrene who was coming in from the countryside. They put the cross on his back and made him carry it behind Jesus. There's a lot of reasons that people have come up to and why Simon was picked to carry Jesus' cross, but it's probably a really simple one. After the abuse that Jesus had suffered, remember, he's at this point been beaten by the religious leaders, he's been beaten by Herod, he's probably been beaten by Pilate. He probably can't carry his cross at this point. So someone else has to do it. So they just grab this guy named Simon. But it's an interesting detail to leave in, because it probably means that Luke talked to this guy to find out some details. See, that's the neat thing about our Gospels is they record information, and obviously we can't go back and talk with these people now, but at the time it was written, you could. If you got Luke's gospel and you read this and you go, well, this can't be real. And then you go, wait, I know a guy named Simon. He's from Cyrene. He was there. You can check. It's one of the coolest things about the Bible, especially the gospel accounts in the New Testament, is these are based in actual events that actually happened. So these details that Luke and Matthew and Mark and John all put in their gospels were things that the people of the time could check, especially since most of these gospels were written within 30, 40 years of the events that they're describing. So these aren't just fantastic tales, these are tales of facts. So a huge crowd of people followed Jesus, including women who were mourning and wailing for him. Jesus turned to the women and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't cry for me. Rather, cry for yourselves and your children. The time will come when they will say, 'Happy are those who are unable to become pregnant, the wombs that never gave birth, and the breasts that never nursed a child.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' If they do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" This is Jesus kind of roundaboutly again prophesying the destruction of Jerusalem that's going to happen in about 40 years from this time. See, there's a big rebellion. It's called the Second Jewish Rebellion because it's not the first. And this is the event that led to the burning of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple. You might have heard of the siege of Masada. All of these things happened in this revolt around 72, 74-ish AD. I can't remember the exact date. But this is Jesus prophesying those events when Jerusalem will be burning and the people will have to flee. So they also led two other criminals to be executed with Jesus. When they arrived at the place called the Skull, they crucified him along with the criminals, one on his right and the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing." And they drew lots as a way of dividing up his clothing. That's actually one of the few kind of dark perks of being on execution detail is you get some of the condemned person's stuff. And that's what happened. We learned from, I think, Matthew's gospel that this is also a fulfillment of some prophecy, but it shows what kind of thing Jesus is going through. Crucifixion was always meant to be not a punishment so much as a deterrent. This is a way of executing someone so that the entire town can look at someone on a cross and say, don't do what this guy did, because crucifixion was awful. This isn't the kind of death that was meant to be quick and painless. It was meant to be long and painful. The word excruciating comes from this experience. This is, let's just say, one of the major perks of being a Roman citizen is you were no longer eligible to be crucified unless you did something really bad like treason. And that's a big perk of being a Roman citizen. And so Jesus is now being made an example of with these two other people who also did things that merited crucifixion. Honestly, they might have even been Barabbas's friends, the guy who got released. They might have all been caught in the same rebellion. We don't know any of that for sure, but it's entirely possible if they're all being executed at the same time. The people were standing around watching, but the leaders sneered at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself if he's really the Christ sent from God, the chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him. They came up to him offering sour wine and saying, "If you really are the king of the Jews, save yourself." Above his head was a notice of the formal charge against him. It read, "This is the King of the Jews." It's always interesting. We always talk about how Jesus Jesus was executed unjustly, and he was, but legally, everything that happened was legal. So that's the dangerous thing, is this was not an illegal execution. It was very unjust, but Jesus was executed for committing treason, for claiming to be a king when Caesar is the only king that the people should have. It tells us how dangerous it can be for the tyranny of, well, things that are legal. Because, especially in Luke's description, everything's by the book. His first trial is in daylight. It's barely in daylight, but it's in daylight, where the religious leaders decide that Jesus deserves to die. Pilate's trial is perfectly legal. He may not have wanted to kill Jesus. He may have thought Jesus was innocent, but he was the authority. He was the law. And when he said that Jesus is being executed for being the king of the Jews, that's what it is. There was nothing illegal about what happened to Jesus, but it was incredibly unjust because the things that Jesus was accused of are things that he did not do. So one of the criminals hanging next to Jesus insulted him along with the others. I mean, it's just, can you imagine? Like, all of these people, and all they're doing is making fun of Jesus. So one of the criminals hanging next to Jesus insulted him, "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." Responding, the other criminal spoke harshly to him, "Don't you fear God, seeing that you've also been sentenced to die? We are rightly condemned, for we are receiving the appropriate sentence for what we did, but this man has done nothing wrong." He gets it. He's saying, I deserve this. The other criminal deserves this. Barabbas deserved this. But this Jesus guy, he doesn't deserve any of this. He didn't do anything wrong. And then he looked at Jesus and said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus replied, "I assure you that today you will be with me in paradise." That is just such an amazing interaction, because it shows us who God is. I mean, this criminal probably, he did something that was really bad. I apologize for the crying dog. There's something outside that she wants. Well, she can wait. This criminal, this guy who's, as he says, rightly condemned, recognizes Jesus's both innocence and recognizes at least some part of who Jesus is and what Jesus is all about. Because he asked Jesus, when you get your kingdom, when you receive the kingdom that you are promised, remember me. It's so fascinating that this criminal says, remember me, and that's all I ask. I don't want anything else. I just want you to remember who I am when you come in power. And Jesus' own disciples go, hey, when you get your power, can I sit at your right hand and my brother sit at your left? But this thief on the cross gets it. And so Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. It was now about noon, and darkness covered the whole earth until about 3 o'clock, while the sun stopped shining. Then the curtain in the sanctuary tore down the middle. So this is a curtain that actually didn't exist in the first temple, but it existed in the second temple. So the way the temple is set up is you can kind of think of it as a rectangle that is 3 times longer than it is wide. And one part of that rectangle is a perfect cube, and that's the most holy place. It's the place where in the first temple, the tablets of stone lived, the Ark of the Covenant lived. In the second temple, it was a lot more symbolic because those things weren't there anymore. But this is still considered the place where God lives. This it's called the Holy of Holies, or the most holy place. And separating it from the holy place, which is kind of the other portion of this rectangle, was a very thick curtain. And it symbolized this difference between, the holy place where God is and the not quite as holy place where other things can just kind of happen. And at this moment, right before Jesus dies, that curtain gets ripped. And it's a symbol of now something different happening, because it's a symbol that God is no longer confined to this cube in the temple. But the way that my Bible talks about it is actually really cute. It says that God is now let loose in the world. I just like that image. God's no longer in this cube. He's out. He's out of his box, and who knows what he's going to get up to. I mean, we know what God's going to get up to, but you get what I mean. Crying out in a loud voice, Jesus said, "Father, into your hands I entrust my life." And after he said this, he breathed for the last time. When the centurion saw what had happened, he praised God, saying, "It's really true. This man was righteous." This is the guy in charge of the execution detail. So he probably wasn't Jewish. He probably definitely wasn't a follower of Jesus, but watching what had happened to Jesus, even he said, yeah, this guy's innocent. This guy did not deserve what happened to him, and there's something different about him. He's not like the other people I've executed. All the crowds who had come together to see this event returned to their homes, beating their chest after seeing what had happened. And everyone who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance observing these things. Now there was a man named Joseph who was a member of the council. He was a good and righteous man. He hadn't agreed with the plan and actions of the council. He was from the Jewish city of Arimathea and eagerly anticipated God's kingdom. This man went to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. So we have these two groups of people. Well, a group of people and one person. We've got Jesus' disciples who kind of kept far away. They wanted to watch, but they didn't want to get too close lest they get in trouble too. So these are the people who were closest to Jesus, and they were pretty far away. But then there's this guy, Joseph, who is well respected enough that he has access to Pilate. He is on the Jewish ruling council, but wasn't part of the group that condemned Jesus earlier in this chapter. And he does probably one of the single bravest things in the entirety of this gospel. He goes up to Pilate and asks for Jesus' body. That is a bold move, especially for someone with as much to lose as Joseph has, because he is asking for the body of a condemned traitor. I don't think I could do that. Taking it down, Joseph wrapped it in a linen cloth and laid it in a tomb carved out of the rock in which no one had ever been buried. It was the preparation day for the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was quickly approaching. The woman who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph. They saw the tomb and how Jesus' body was laid in it. Then they went away and prepared fragrant spices and perfumed oils. They rested on the Sabbath in keeping with the commandment. See, there's an interesting thing in Jewish custom, even today, and I'm not real well read into this, but this is kind of what I've learned as I've been looking into this. The general rule is you want somebody to be buried within 24 hours, but if it's a Sabbath, there's certain things that you can't do even in the course of preparing a corpse for burial. So wrapping it in linen, that's fine, but some of the extra stuff to make it I guess, kind of not really legitimate's not the right word, but some of the other rituals, you can't do those on the Sabbath, so they had to wait. And so these women were waiting and watching, and they got everything ready so that when the Sabbath was over, they could then go first thing in the morning and do these kind of last couple of funeral rites for Jesus's body. The kind of things that would be due to someone who they held in the respect that they held Jesus. And that's where we're going to end today, because next week we'll wrap up our study of Luke's gospel by finding out what happens when the women go to the tomb very early on that first day of the week, after the Sabbath is over and everything's ready, and what they find when they go to anoint Jesus' body. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk again next week.